morning. So good to see you this morning. Thanks. So good to see you guys this morning and to be here today. I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to share with you on this topic. As Pastor Carl said before, I'm head of student welfare at the school that I work at. So care and caring for those who are maybe a little bit broken, a little bit lost is something that's really close to my heart. But I'll share more on that in just a moment. When I was preparing for this week, a movie that I saw when I was about probably 13 came back to my mind, and it was called Walking Across Egypt. Has anybody heard of it? No one in the first service had either, except my mum, and that's because she watched it with me. But this movie it's pretty obscure, it's not very well known, and when I was about 13, I was walking through Blockbuster and it caught my attention. And the reason it caught my attention, in all honesty, was because Jonathan Taylor Thomas was in it, and as a 13-year-old girl, I thought he was pretty alright. So I was like, alright, I'll watch this movie. And anyway, it tells the story of a young juvenile delinquent who is locked up, thrown into juvie. He has no family, no one to come and visit him, until one day, this elderly lady who had recently attended a church service, and during that church service, they'd spoken on the verse out of Matthew that says, "Do to the least of these, so take care of the least of these and you're taking care of me." That's a very paraphrased version, but along those lines. So this old lady had heard this sermon and she's like, you know what? The least of these. How about I go and visit some young man in prison who has no family and just bring him some cake? So she does that. She rocks up to the prison and she's like, you know, which inmate doesn't have any family? Okay, I'll go visit them. And she goes and visits this young man. Now, as the story goes, he escapes from juvie, finds where she lives, and rocks up at her house, and then convinces her, as you only could in Hollywood movies, that he's out on good behaviour. And he needs a place to stay for a few nights. So, being a Hollywood movie, she obviously goes, oh, of course, come on in, yeah, come stay with me. So he stays with her for a few days, and she just cares for him. She provides him with some food, some clothes, challenges some of his attitudes and behaviours, and you see their relationship grow. And throughout the movie, their relationship has its ups and downs. He slips back into old habits and steals things and all that kind of thing. Anyway, he gets caught and thrown back into juvie. But through this process of her caring for him, he is completely changed. When she first met him, he was very hard-hearted, very rough, didn't want anything to do with anyone, didn't care about anything. And through this process of her taking him in and just showing basic care for him, he is completely changed. Because in reality, he had not experienced anything like that in his world. Now, it's not a very well-known film, but it has stuck with me all these years. So much so, it's one of my favourite films that I've ever seen. So much so that I thought, I've got to get a copy of this for my DVD collection. So, searched all the online shops in Australia, couldn't find it. Apparently Blockbuster in Bundaberg must have been the only place that this DVD existed, and by the time I was looking for it, it was no longer there. So, searched online, I'm like, you know what, I'll just order it from overseas. So I did, ordered it from overseas, waited weeks for it to arrive. It arrived, I'm like, yes, I'm going to sit down and watch it, put it in my DVD player, and it was in the wrong region. So I now own the DVD but can't watch it because it's in the wrong region. So if anyone wants to borrow it, you're welcome to, because I can't watch it. So just let me know after the service and I'll hook you up. But the thing that stuck with me most about this movie was the power of the love of God. So this woman had heard a sermon preached about loving the least of these, and she's like, all right, I'll just go out there and do that. And she did, and it was through that love of God and her care for this young man that his life was radically changed. She didn't do any massive gestures or anything. She didn't do anything that was out of this world, anything extraordinary. She cooked him a few meals, provided him a bed to sleep in, and provided him with some clothes. Very basic things, but she just cared for him and it changed his life. Now, Carl mentioned when he invited me up before that I'm head of student welfare at my school. And I've been doing that role for probably about 1.5 years, but prior to that I've been doing welfare coordinator roles for about 4 or 5 years. Now, some people may have no idea what that is. So for those of you that have no idea what I'm talking about, basically I spend a lot of my time working with the students who get kicked out of class for various behavioural choices. I work with them on helping them get back into class and make positive choices. And I also work with a lot of kids who are just struggling in life. And that could be really minor things, or it could be really, really big, tough stuff. And I just get alongside them, have conversations with them, help them find the help that they need in counsellors or whatever else, and just generally just care for them. But there was this one kid, and I love this kid, and as I do all the naughty kids, I just love them, which is probably a good thing. I'm doing what I'm doing. But this one kid, a couple of years ago, he was getting kicked out of class almost every day. Not every class, but quite frequently. And that meant that he often would be sent up to my office, and we would sit down and have conversation after conversation. And initially, these conversations were all just about his behaviour. What choice had you made? How can we make a better choice next time? Etc., etc. But as we continued to spend so much time together, our conversations evolved, and it became more about, well, why do you think we put these boundaries in place? Why do you think we do these things? And started talking about that care factor, that the reason that his teachers were providing these boundaries or pulling him up on these things was actually because we cared about him and we cared about his future. Now, he was a very cheeky young man, quite disrespectful at times, and so I spent a lot of time with him. But over the year and a bit that we had all these conversations, you really saw this heart change in him. He became really open to those conversations about, well, what is my future looking like and where am I going with that? Long story short, he ended up getting offered a rugby scholarship at another school, and he was a bit hesitant to take it at first because the school that he was at, so our school, had become a really safe place for him by that point. He'd really turned a corner and was starting to put effort in class and all of those things. But he took the scholarship, and it's fantastic. He's gone from strength to strength. He became really focused in school and worked really hard in his classes, and also was doing really well in rugby as well. He invited me along to a couple of his games, and I went there and cheered him on. But the big thing was that all it took for this kid to make those changes was to know that someone cared. And it was through caring for him and letting him know that we cared and that he was worthy of that care that he turned things around and started to really see that himself as well. So we can't underestimate the power of care. Has anyone here, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, has anyone here ever had someone rock up to your doorstep with a meal at just the right time? Maybe you've had a loss in the family, or your family's been facing some sickness, and you just needed some support, and someone's shown up with a meal. Or it could have been that, it was a really great thing and there's a new baby, but also very hectic, and someone's shown up with a meal. Has anyone experienced that? Yeah, quite a few of you. How does that make you feel? Pretty good, right? Or one of the ones that I am very blessed to receive every now and then is the timely text message. Like the one that you get from a friend and you read it and you're like, have they been reading my mail? Like, this is dead on what I'm going through right now. And it's just encouraging and uplifting. Has anyone ever had that happen to them? Yeah. How does that make you feel? You see, those small acts of care have huge implications. They have massive impact on our lives, and they actually build and strengthen our community as well. And because of that, and because so many of you who have experienced that kind of care, we tend to think that humanity was always like that. People have always cared like that. They've always looked out for each other, haven't they? Well, it's not necessarily the case. You see, caring for your fellow man and looking out for strangers or whoever else, that's actually something that was instigated by Jesus himself. He was the game changer in that arena. Now, when I was preparing for this, I thought I'd look up the definition of game changer. We've all heard the phrase before. We've all heard someone say, that person was a game changer, particularly in football or whatever else. But game changer itself, I wanted to see what the dictionary had to say about it, or at least what Google had to say. And this is what Google said. A game changer is a newly introduced element or factor that changes an existing situation or activity in a significant way. So it changes something in a significant way. It's not that it didn't exist before. It's not that people never cared, but it changed in a significant way. The motivation behind that care changed. We're very fortunate in the world that we live in that we're so connected. We see a lot of things from different places around the world because of our access to media. And one of those things is that we're actually really exposed to a lot of the disadvantaged, marginalized, and hurting people around the world. We can see these things through media. And the thing is, there have always been hurting, disadvantaged, and marginalized people. And I find, because I can see so much of it, sometimes it can be really overwhelming as to, well, what could I do from my little house in Riverview to have an impact on caring for those people? But humanity has not always been caring towards these marginalized people. You see, care was often based on societal position or what you could bring to the table. What could you do to benefit society? It was Jesus who taught us to get a grip on caring for people in those marginalized, disadvantaged, lost places. Like we've said throughout this series, we've looked at equality and leadership, and each time we've said it wasn't always that way. Equality didn't always look like it does today. Leadership didn't always look like it does today. And it's the same with care. Care didn't always look like it does today. Jesus was the one who changed the game in that arena. Now I just want to pause for a moment and just acknowledge anyone who's here for maybe the first time, or you're just coming to check it out. Firstly, I want to say welcome. We're so glad that you came today. But I would also like to make a disclaimer on this next statement. If you wouldn't say that you have a faith in Christ, then I give you full permission to disagree with what I'm about to say. But if you would claim to be a follower of Christ, then I would ask you to allow your hearts to be challenged by this next statement. You see, I believe that without Jesus, we can get caught up in this individualistic notion. We can get caught up thinking that we are the most important individual on this planet. And we can go about living our lives like an every man for himself kind of lifestyle. You see, I believe that this whole idea of caring for others, that if it's not motivated by an understanding of the worth of that individual in Christ, that their intrinsic worth as an image bearer of Christ, then it could almost be that we're doing it because it makes us feel good about being good people. I'm not saying don't do good, definitely do good, encouraging that, but I'm just saying that without Jesus, that motivation is different, and Jesus came to change our motivation. He came to change our motives on how we care and why we care. It's not always been in humanity's nature to care, and I'll say that a few times because I think we just tend to get stuck into thinking that this is just the way it's always been. Sometimes we need to dig a little deeper, and that's why we're doing a series like this, to go, hang on, Jesus really did change the game. He really made a huge impact, a huge difference, not just in our lives individually, of course that happened, but in the way that the world operates and the way that we see and do things today. So I want to just throw to the screen in a moment. We're going to have a look at a bit of a clip from the series Jesus the Game Changer.
Well, I'm sure there were Romans who cared about one another. I mean, obviously, people do. But it wasn't built into the system. It wasn't part of the thing that everybody was raised believing. And the fact that we have these views in the West is because we were raised in these traditions and in these views. Now, of course, some of this came from the Judeo tradition within which Jesus arose. It's of course the secret of the West.
I love how he refers to it as the secret of the West. We've been raised in these traditions, so we don't necessarily question when or how they came about. But the fact is that Jesus really changed things in this arena. Now, there's heaps of examples in the Bible of Jesus demonstrating care. One of my favorite examples is the story of Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood. So I just want you to picture with me for a moment. Jesus steps off the boat. He's coming from somewhere, and he steps off the boat, and there's a huge crowd of people. Wherever Jesus was, there was always a crowd. Huge crowd of people crowding around him. He starts walking along. All of a sudden, this synagogue ruler, so this important guy in society, comes forward and he's like, Jesus, calls out to Jesus, falls to his knees in front of him. And we'll have a look at the scripture. It says in Mark 5, verse 22 to 24, Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name is Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. So Jairus was a pretty important guy. He would have been fairly well known in that society, in that community, and he would have been well respected as well. So he was in a good position in society. And he's come to seek out Jesus because his daughter is sick and dying. Anyway, Jesus is like, "Yep, I got your back, man. I'm coming with you." He probably didn't say that. He was probably a little bit more formal. But he agrees to go with Jairus, and the whole crowd follows. So everyone's crowding around Jesus, walking on to Jairus' house. And then all of a sudden, Jesus stops in his tracks. Like they're walking, and then they're not. Now, I don't know about you, but I tend to picture things a little bit. And I picture that kind of like in the cartoons where the front person stops and everyone just kind of runs into them. I mean, this is a crowd. They don't walk in two straight lines, not touching one another. They would have been like jostling and pushing each other. And so Jesus stops in his tracks. I'm sure there are a few people who are like, whoa. But the reason that Jesus stops is because in amongst all of this, while this is happening, there's this woman with the issue of blood. Now, she's been sick for 12 years. She has spent all her money on doctors trying to find a cure, and she is desperate. She should not have been there. She was considered ceremonially unclean in the Jewish tradition. She shouldn't have been around people, all right? But she is like, you know what? I got nothing left to lose. I am desperate, and I've heard that this Jesus guy can heal, so I'm just going to go for it. So in amongst this crowd, she's like kind of pushing through, and I kind of picture her getting real low, and she's thought, maybe if I just reach out and touch his coat, if I just stretch out and just touch it, then I'll be healed. So she risks it all. She gets in there, she pushes through, touches his coat, and at that moment, Jesus stops. Now, if I was her, I would have been like, oh no, it's happened. Jesus has stopped. The crowd is like, what is going on? Jesus is telling his disciples that someone's touched him. They're all kind of like, there's lots of people around Jesus. And he goes, no, I felt power go out from me. Now, we pick up the story in Mark 5:32 to 34. It says, "But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is now over.'" So Jesus is on an important mission. Jairus is an important guy, and he was on his way to his house to heal his daughter. And yet this woman, who shouldn't have even been there, an outcast of society, has stopped him in his tracks. And he doesn't mind. Instead, he turns to her. He acknowledges what she has done. He acknowledges her bravery to do that and her faith to do that, heals her, and sets her free. Pretty incredible stuff. But it doesn't end there. Jesus continues on. He's on a mission to Jairus' house, continues on to Jairus' house, sees all the weeping people there because Jairus' daughter is very sick. She's on her deathbed. And he walks in and he heals her as well. And it says in Mark 5:41 to 42, "Holding her hand, he said to her, 'Talitha cum,' which means, 'Little girl, get up.' And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed." Now, this account is pretty cool anyway, but what I love about it is the diversity of people that Jesus shows care and compassion to. Jairus, consider him as like the cream of the crop. He was well positioned in society, and Jesus takes time to care for him and his needs. But then he's also stopped in his tracks by a woman who shouldn't have even been there, by an outcast of society, the lowliest of lows. But then the other one that I think sometimes we may even miss is that this young girl is healed. Now, in a society where you were considered worthy of care based on what you could provide for the society, a 12-year-old girl didn't have a whole lot to give. And yet Jesus stops and goes, she is worthy of care and compassion too. You see, Jesus didn't see the outward adornments of these people, but rather their hurting hearts. And so he steps in and cares for them. And he broke through those social barriers and totally revolutionized the way people considered who was worthy of care. He challenges the prerequisites for care and says, no. Everybody is worthy of care and compassion because they are created in my image. This whole series has been awesome, but this whole series is not just about equipping you with more information. It's not just about making sure that you've got the right answers and that you are great at debating the case for Christ and his undeniable impact in this world. That's all well and good, but it's actually about allowing ourselves to be challenged, to reflect that we are game changers in this society as well and in this community. It's about reflecting Jesus' heart and the things that he changed so that they may know his love. I wonder if we look honestly at our lives, and myself included, if we could say that we show that same indiscriminate love and compassion for people in our community, people in our workplace, people in our family maybe. See, that's the trademark of Christ in our lives, is that care and compassion for others. Something that I think has been well publicised in the media in recent years is the whole idea of championing the rights of the defenceless. It's something that is well publicised, it's something that people are getting on board with, all the different causes. But we could think, again, that that's how it's always been, that we've always cared for people who are in disadvantaged places or spaces or are hurt and broken. But it was actually that compassion and care for strangers particularly was completely revolutionary. It was completely new to the way that people conducted themselves. Now, like I said before, historically, people were considered worthy of care based on their status. So if you could provide, had a good job in society, if you were someone important, then you were worthy of care. We want to take care of you and make sure that you're all healthy and doing well. But you were also considered worthy of care based on what you could provide for society. So if we look back in ancient times, a child who was born with a disability would be placed outside and left there, because that child couldn't provide anything for society. So we need to consider that when we think about how we care for others now. It is so different to that mindset. And the reason it's different is because of Jesus and what he came and taught us about. See, in classical Rome, there was actually no welfare system at all. I'm a history teacher, so I love history stuff as well. And in classical Rome, no welfare system at all. Yet, if we look at the Hebrew Bible, that whole idea of care is weaved throughout the entire Bible. Because God had a plan for how we care for others before history even caught onto it, before society even caught onto it. He wrote it into his word because it was so close to his heart. Now, there was a period in history where there were two really devastating plagues that hit Rome. And we're going to find out a little bit more about those.
Rodney, what was it that Jesus taught that the early church picked up on that kind of shifted?
Well, I suppose the main thing he taught is that life was sacred. That the life of everyone, that people were to take care of one another, that we were our brother's keepers, that we had a responsibility to look after the old and the young and the disabled and the ill. It showed up incredibly during the two great plagues that hit the Roman Empire very early in Christian days. The wealthy Romans fled the cities when it happened, including the physicians and the priests. The Christians stayed. They nursed the ill, took care of people, and as a consequence, some of them died of the plague, of course. But Christians survived the plague at a much higher rate because, as a matter of fact, if you give people food and water and care for them during the height of their illness, many of them will survive. And so there was apparent to all these pagan neighbors that the Christians were outliving them because they're taking care of one another.
So in antiquity, there was no, and when I say antiquity, I mean classic Rome, there was no welfare state, right? That's a modern invention. So if you were sick and you were poor, you were in trouble, basically. If you were a traveller, if you're a foreigner and you ran out of money or you got robbed or something, you were in trouble. And it was the Christians who tried to do something about this. And that really goes back to the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible is full of stuff about looking after the poor, widows, those who need help. That was really a very Jewish concept that was largely alien to the classical world. I mean, not entirely, people weren't horrible, but the idea that you had a sort of specific moral and religious duty to look after the poor was quite a Jewish innovation, and the Christians took that over.
So those two plagues that they spoke about, the first one was called the Antonine Plague, and it happened in 165 to 180 AD. And in that one plague, 5 million people died. Now, the second plague was called the Cyprian Plague, and it was 251 to 266 AD. And it was thought to be spread from Africa. But in both of these plagues, in both times, the government officials, the wealthy, those in positions, even some of the priests, fled the cities. They were like, nope, we don't want any of this plague. We're going to get out of here before we get it as well. So they fled the city to the countryside to stay safe and healthy. But the Christians stayed behind. And they became this great army of caretakers who got alongside the sick and cared for them, regardless of their position, regardless of what they would get in return, and regardless of the fact that they're risking their own lives as well. Now, behaviour like this actually caught the attention of the pagan priests in ancient times as well. So the pagan priests, Julian the Apostate was a supreme pontiff of one of these areas, and he actually wrote a letter to his priests, so the guys that were under him, saying, you know what, guys, we need to get on board this care thing. So let's have a little look at what he had to say. He wrote to his priests, and he said, we must pay especial attention to this point, and by this means effect a cure. For when it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by the priests, his priests, then I think that the impious Galileans observed this fact and devoted themselves to philanthropy. And they have gained ascendancy in the worst of their deeds through the credit they win for such practices. And he goes on to say that it's almost like the Christians are enticing them with cake. They're going, oh, we're providing all this nice stuff, and then they're going to turn their backs on them later. He's talking to his priests going, you know what, we've got to care as well. And he actually says at the end there that this same method have turned many of them to Christ. He says to atheism, but he's talking about turning away from the pagan gods, so turning to Christ. And he was so adamant that the priests had to get on board this care thing. They had to do this better than the Christians did. Now, the funny thing is that the priests did this for a little while, but they couldn't keep up that practice. It got me asking why. And the reason was the motive behind it. If someone tells me that I've got to go and do something, I'll do it. But my heart may not be in it. My motivation may not be there. And that's what kind of happened with these pagan priests. They were told, you must go care. And so they did. They went out and tried it. But the difference was that the Christians were actually motivated by this understanding of the intrinsic worth of each individual. That each individual was an image bearer of Christ and therefore worthy of love, care, and compassion. Now, like that clip said before, it's not that the Romans didn't care. It's not that they were totally hard-hearted and were just like, oh, yep, fend for yourself, you'll be fine. They obviously cared for those that were in their sphere of influence, their families, their friends, but it was different. It wasn't this care for the strangers, for the lost, for the broken, for the outcast. Because that's not the way the Roman system was built. But it is the way that the Christian community was built. Now, when I was preparing, one of the things that it showed in this series was this awesome little snippet from this guy talking about that sacrifice of serving others. So let's have a look at that.
But it is to say, there's nothing about atheism or secularism or the idea that the material world is all that exists that says there is a dignity and worth to suffering or dying people that I ought to sacrifice myself for. But the belief that there is a God like the one that Jesus taught of, who says that the most pain-filled, most disabled, most hurting human being carries the image of God, and that it's an ennobling thing to sacrifice for them. Well, there's dynamite in that has moved people for many, many centuries to be willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of folks that in the ancient world were just put on the dung heap.
I was so humbled by how he talks about it being an ennobling act to sacrifice for those that are in need of care. And the thing that I find humbling about it is that Jesus asks us to partner with him in that mission. He could have done it himself, he could have come and cared for everyone, but he actually gives that to us to be caring and to bring that love and compassion to our community. Now, one of the things that shows us in the Bible that this was a completely revolutionary thought was a verse in Matthew where it talks about the world says, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. That's what the world says. Yet I tell you, love your neighbor and pray for those, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So Matthew 5:43-48 says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This was totally countercultural. If you think of ancient society, it was they're the enemy, we don't do anything nice to them, we don't want anything to do with them at all. We want to keep ourselves safe, we want to care for ourselves only. And Jesus comes in and goes, whoa, no. That's not how it works. I want you to love your enemies and pray for them as well and care for them as well. And this was just mind-blowing to those who heard it. They were like, wait, what? You want me to, what? That's different. That's new. And we see this carried through history where people are reaching out to those that are lost, broken, and hurting. Even if you would consider yourself to be secular or of a different religion, we still believe that we should be motivated by this love for people, that our actions should speak out of that love and care for other individuals. When I was growing up, we used to listen to these things called, well, I called them yellow tapes, kids' praise, integrity music. Anyone heard of them? A few people? Awesome. Well, the rest of you are in for a treat today. So I'm going to play a little snippet of a song. It's some pretty great stuff. So let's listen to that song, shall we?
Draw me nearer, Holy Spirit.
It's pretty great. Oh, so good. Really pronounce that P there. Oh, so good, right? Those of you who haven't had yellow tapes, you're really missing out here. Thanks, Nick. So these yellow tapes, I swear my parents must be saints because we listened to them non-stop. Every time we got in the car, the yellow tapes went on, and I think it's probably a very good thing that we lived in Bundaberg because it takes no longer than 15 minutes to get anywhere, which is probably the only reason we were allowed to listen to these tapes so much. But one of the really cool things from these tapes was that it helped me learn scripture. And a verse that has stuck with me all these years is John 13:35. And I still remember the rhyme that goes with it, but I'm not going to give you that demo today. Sorry, guys. Maybe next time. But it's, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And this verse has stuck with me for years and years and years. And it's our key tell as followers of Christ. If we claim to be followers of Christ, this love should be evident. This care for one another should be evident. Now, Matthew Henry is an 18th century Bible commentator, and his commentaries are still widely used today. And he is brilliant. I love reading a bit of Matthew Henry. But he writes on this particular verse, brotherly love is the badge of Christ's disciples. By this he knows them, by this they may know themselves, and by this others may know them. This is the very livery of his family, the distinguishing character of his disciples. This he would have them noted for, as that wherein they excelled all others, their loving one another. This was what their master was famous for. All that ever heard of him have heard of his love, his great love. That is the true honor of Christ's disciples, to excel in brotherly love. Nothing will be more effectual than this, to recommend them to the esteem and respect of others. See what a powerful, attractive it was. This is what we're talking about when we talk about caring for others. It is our badge. It is our livery as followers of Christ. It is the thing that shouts from the rooftops about what he has done in our lives. And I love that last part. See what a powerful, attractive it was. When we care well for others and care well for our community and care well for one another, it draws people in. They go, hey, why are you doing that? What's your motivation? It causes them to ask questions, which allows us to then speak of the amazing sacrifice of Christ. Now, Jossie Chaco is someone that you may be familiar with if you've been at Catalyst for a little bit. We support part of his ministry, MPART, over in India. And he had a little bit to say on this topic as well.
You're nowhere near retirement, or Tasmania, actually. So what was the passion and vision for India? How did that come?
It wasn't so much about passion for India, but more about begin to ask me the question, why am I here? You know, what is the purpose? So God saved my life and, helped me with employment and money, and now I go and live in a hobby farm and then die and go to heaven. So what's the purpose of living life here? And ultimately, I found that purpose. And in that, I had really two deep convictions. One was that the purpose for any Christian to live is to fulfill the Great Commission. And second was that we must give the opportunity to share the gospel with people who have never heard or least opportunity to hear. And the third is that we must help those that are at the bottom of the social economic chain. And so when we looked around the world, incredibly found that this part of the world has the largest group of people who never heard the gospel. Second, it has the largest poor people. 6 of the North Indian state has more poor people than all of Africa put together. And then, of course, the caste system and illiteracy and the socio-economic and injustice that is taking place. I felt compelled to do something about it. And Paul says, my ambition is to preach Christ to those who never heard it before. And looking at the book of Acts and the early church, they were sharing gospel, making disciples, and they were helping the widows and the orphans to such a level there was no needs among them.
How incredible would that be, to be part of a society where there's no needs among them because we're caring so well for one another? That's pretty mind-blowing to me. Yet that's what we're called to do. We're called to care. We're called to support those who are marginalised, disadvantaged, those who are just having a bad day. It's our call to love others with that love of Christ. And it's through that love and compassion that the sacrifice of Christ at Calvary can be most effectively and clearly understood, because its whole foundation is in that agape love. Now, agape love is that love for the unlovely. It's immeasurable, it's incomparable. This love for humankind, it's ongoing and self-sacrificing concern for the lost and the fallen. And it doesn't determine beforehand whether love would actually be the effective or the appropriate response in any particular case. It just is. It's just loving them, regardless of where they're at. Now, that's a pretty revolutionary thought. That's not something that humanity came up with. That's something that God came up with. And for me, this whole idea of that loving the unlovely, well, it kind of makes me look in the mirror and go, you know what? I'm the unloveliest of the unlovelies. Yet Christ saw fit to come and die on a cross that I could spend eternity with him in relationship with God. Now, if that was all God ever did in my life, though it's not, he's done plenty since and he'll continue to because he's a good God. But if that was it, like if that was the full stop exclamation mark, he came, sent Jesus to die for my sins, brought me into a relationship with him, that would be enough. that would be enough for me to make sure that I loved anyone who crossed my path. It would be enough to motivate me to go, hey, you know what? You are worthy of love, care, and compassion. And did you know that the creator of the universe went to extreme lengths to ensure that you knew it? I can't keep that stuff to myself. So maybe today you might feel a little bit like the woman with the issue of blood in that story, where you're a bit hesitant, you're like, you know what? Just leaving it all, and I'm going to reach out and touch his coat. Maybe you're feeling a little more bold and just walk straight up to Jesus like Jairus did. But through these people, through Jairus, through this woman, we see that Jesus doesn't discriminate in who gets care. Everybody does. He's got love, care, and compassion for everybody. And as his followers, we need to be showing the world that as well. I kind of imagine that woman with the issue of blood when she walked away from that encounter. She was completely changed. Her life was full 180. She would have been able to re-enter society. She would have been well, having been sick for 12 years. And I don't think that she probably got up from that encounter and went, cheers, thanks, Jesus, and never said anything about it again for the rest of her days. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what the rest of her days looked like. But I tend to think that this woman, if she was that radically changed by Jesus, wouldn't have kept it to herself. She would have told anyone who would listen, hey, did you hear what Jesus did in my life? And I bet that she would have had a particular heart for those who were broken in a similar way to her. But this time, she would have been able to carry a message of hope to them. And that's the difference that Jesus makes in terms of care and compassion for others. There is hope. And there is a world that desperately needs to hear that. So I'm just going to pray with you in a moment that you would have the boldness to step out and share that hope, that love, that care, that compassion with people in your workplace, people in your family, people in your community. Because Jesus is the game changer, and the world needs to know about it. So will you allow me to just pray with you? Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your love, God, for your extravagant love that sent your Son to the cross that we might know you, God. And I pray that as we leave this place, God, that you would give us a boldness to step out and care for those in our world, God, that you would give us a boldness to care for those in our workplace, in our families, and in our community, God, that they might know the hope that there is in you, God. I pray that you would give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to obey, God, the promptings that you bring into our life of caring and showing love and compassion to those around us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Just before I wrap up, I want to say thank you. I've been a part of this community. Oh, I'm doing it again. I said community so many times in the last service. I was trying not to do it. But I've been part of this community for 2.5 years, and I have to say I love the way that you love on people. One of the things that made me decide to make this church my home was the fact that you're involved in loving the people in our community, and you're committed to that. So thank you, you two, for what you do, and I want to encourage you to continue to be that army of caretakers that our city needs. Thanks, guys.